The new human homeworld turned slowly beneath them, a sphere of blue oceans and green continents that looked achingly similar to the Earth they had left behind. And Princess Sarathivine watched it through the observation window with emotions she could not name. One solar cycle had passed since the duel that had changed everything. One cycle of traveling with humans and learning their ways and discovering that nearly everything she had been taught about them was wrong. Today the blood debt was paid, and she was free to leave. Her attendants had gathered in the small quarters they had shared aboard Do-Yoon's freighter, and the air was thick with words that none of them seemed able to speak. "A transport is waiting to take us to the nearest Volanti station," Yvonne said, and she held a datapad with their departure clearance as if it was something fragile. "We can be home within a month." Tessic stood by the door with her arms crossed, and her face was troubled in ways that Sarathovan had never seen before. "Home," she repeated, and the words sounded hollow. Lorith sat on her bunk, clutching a half-finished blanket made of colorful yarn, and tears were streaming down her silver cheeks without shame. "I do not want to go," she whispered. "The hospital needs me, and Dr. Shin says I have a gift for making patients feel calm. And there is so much more I could learn." "The Empire expects our return," Yvonne said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarathovan looked at each of them in turn. These women who had served her loyally for years, and she saw the same conflict in their eyes that she felt in her heart. "What have we learned here?" she asked quietly. Tessic was the first to answer. "I learned that strength is not just about winning battles," she said, and her voice was rough. "These humans, they train every day knowing they will never be as fast or strong as we are, but they do it anyway, because protecting each other matters more than pride. I learned that politics does not have to be about manipulation and advantage," Yvonne added. "The Colony Council actually listens to its people, actually changes decisions based on what they hear. And I have never seen governance work that way before." Lorith clutched her blanket tighter. "I learned that caring for someone does not make you weak," she said through her tears. "The humans cry when they lose people they love, and then they get up the next day and keep going. And I think that is the bravest thing I've ever seen." Sarathovan nodded slowly. "I learned that mercy is not weakness," she said. "I learned that a man with nothing can defeat a champion with everything if he has something worth fighting for. And I learned that true power is not in what you can take from others, but in what you choose to give." She stood and walked to the door. "Come with me," she said. "There is something I must do." Diane was on the colony ship, helping to organize the landing parties that would begin building humanity's new home. And he looked up with surprise when Sarathovan and her attendants entered the command center. "Princess," he said, and something flickered across his face that might have been sadness. "I heard you were leaving today. That is what I came to discuss," she replied. The humans in the room had stopped working the watch, and Sarathovan was aware of their eyes on her as she approached the captain who had once been a legal master and had never once treated her as anything less than an equal. "The blood debt is paid," she said formally, "and by the laws of my people, I am free to return to the Empire." Do-Yoon nodded, and his expression was carefully neutral. "I hope your journey is safe," he said. "I am not leaving." The words hung in the air, and Do-Yoon's neutral expression shattered into something raw and uncertain. "What?" Sarathovan took a deep breath. "I have sent a message to my father informing him that I will remain here as the Volanthi Empire's first ambassador to humanity," she said. "He will be furious and there may be political consequences. But I have seen what humans truly are, and I believe our peoples must learn from each other." She gestured to her attendants. "Yuvin will serve as diplomatic liaison, handling negotiations between your colony and any Concord species you encounter. For she has learned that honest dealing creates more value than manipulation." Yvonne stepped forward and bowed her head. "Tessic, will help train your defense forces, Sarathovan continued. For she has seen that courage matters more than natural ability. And she wishes to help protect the people who taught her this. Tessik's bow was stiff, but her eyes were bright, and Larth will work with Dr. Shin to build your colony's first hospital, Sarathovan finished. For she has discovered that healing others heals something in herself as well. Lorith was crying again, but she was also smiling. Do-Hyun stared at them. These 4 Volanti women who had been his property and were now choosing to become his allies. And Sarathovan saw moisture gathering in his eyes that he tried to blink away. Why? He asked, and his voice cracked on the words. Sarathovan stepped closer to him, close enough to see the scars that still marked his shoulder where a plasma blade had nearly killed him. Because you showed me what humans are, she said. You do not conquer through strength or cunning, but through something far more dangerous. You genuinely believe that everyone deserves to be saved, and you are stubborn enough to act on that belief. She smiled, and it felt strange on her face, an expression she had rarely worn before coming aboard this ship. If that makes me foolish, then I will be foolish with you. The humans in the command center began to cheer, and Do-Hyun laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that transformed his tired face. Welcome to the colony, Ambassador, he said, and he extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Sarathovan took it, feeling the warmth of his skin against her silver fingers. And she knew that this moment would be remembered in the histories of both their peoples. Later, at the founding ceremony of the new colony, a reporter from one of the other Concord species asked Do-Hyun how he felt about releasing the princess when the law had given her to him. He looked at Sarathovan, standing beside him as an equal, and then back at the reporter with a smile that carried no regret. I gained something better than what the law offered, he said. I gained allies who chose to stand with us, and friends who stayed because they wanted to, not because they had to. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft. That is worth more than any prize. Princess Sarathovan, first ambassador of the Volanthi Empire to humanity, looked out at the crowd of humans and aliens gathered to witness this new beginning, and she felt something she had never expected to find so far from home. She felt like she belonged, and when she laughed at something, Do-Hyun whispered to her. The sound carried across the assembly like a promise of what their 2 peoples could become together. Not master and servant, not conqueror and conquered, but partners walking into an uncertain future side by side in the stands. Yevhen was already deep in conversation with the colony council. Tessik was arm wrestling with a group of human soldiers who refused to admit defeat. And Lorith was teaching a circle of children how to knit while Dr. Shin looked on with pride. They had come as prisoners of law and stayed as family by choice, and that, Sarathovan thought, was the most human thing of all. 2 months into the journey toward humanity's new homeworld, Princess Sarathovan stood at the observation deck of Do-Hyun's freighter and watched the colony ship Horizon's Promise drift alongside them like a great metal whale swimming through the void. She had expected many things when she accepted the blood debt. None of them good. She had expected cruelty, for that was what any Volanti lord would have shown to defeated enemies. She had expected humiliation, for that was how power was demonstrated among her people. She had expected to count the days until her release like a prisoner, marking time on a cell wall. Instead, she had found something she could not explain. Something that made no sense according to everything she had been taught about humans and lesser species and the natural order of the galaxy. She had found kindness. The door behind her opened, and Yevhen entered with a datapad in her hands and a thoughtful expression on her face. The security training session went well today, she reported, and there was something in her voice that the princess had never heard before, something that might have been admiration. Captain Do-Hyun's volunteers are improving faster than I thought possible. Tessic is actually enjoying herself, Sarathovan observed, and she turned to face her senior attendant. I saw her laughing with the human trainees yesterday. They're stubborn, Yevon admitted. They lack natural talent and proper training, and their bodies are not built for combat the way Volanti are. But they refuse to quit, no matter how many times they fail. She paused, and her next words came slowly, as if she was admitting something shameful. I find that I respect them for it. Sarathovan nodded, for she had seen the same thing in 100 small moments since they had come aboard. She had watched humans share their limited food rations with alien refugees they had rescued from a damaged station, giving up their own meals so that strangers could eat. She had watched Do-yoon work 18-hour shifts alongside his crew, never asking anyone to do something he would not do himself. She had watched the colony ship's council meetings, where decisions were made through debate and voting rather than through force or noble birthright. And she had watched Larth, her youngest attendant, transform from a frightened girl into someone who smiled when she entered the medical bay each morning. Where's Lorith now? She asked, with Dr. Shin. Yevon replied. She has been helping to care for the elderly passengers who fell ill last week. And I believe she cried when one of them died yesterday. Cried for a human? The old woman had been teaching her to knit, Yevon said, and her voice was soft. Apparently, humans make things with string to pass the time and to show affection. And Lorith had been making a blanket for her when she passed. Sarathovan was quiet for a long moment. Among the Volanthi, death was acknowledged with ceremony and ritual, but grief was considered a private weakness that should not be displayed. Yet she had seen humans weep openly for their dead, had seen them comfort each other without shame, and had seen them celebrate lives that had ended rather than simply filing away records. They feel everything so deeply, she said at last. Every emotion is written on their faces for all to see, and they do not seem to consider it a vulnerability. Perhaps because it is not, Yevon suggested. Perhaps there is strength in allowing others to see your heart. Before Sarathovan could respond, an alarm began to blare throughout the ship, and Do-yoon's voice came over the communication system with an urgency that made her blood run cold. All hands to emergency stations. We have hostile contacts dropping out of hyperspace. And this is not a drill. Sarathovan and Yevon ran to the bridge, where they found Do-hyun standing before the main view screen with his jaw set and his hands gripping the console, so hard that his knuckles had turned white on the screen. A fleet of ships was forming a blockade between them and open space, and the symbols on their hulls marked them as Void Raiders, pirates who had terrorized this sector for decades. How many? Sarathovan asked. 15 ships. Do-hyun replied without turning around. At least 3 times our firepower. And they are demanding that we surrender the colony ship and all its passengers. Slaves. Tessic spat from her position at the tactical console, where she had taken over from the junior officer. They want to sell our people as slaves. The irony was not lost on any of them. Do-hyun turned to his crew, and Sarathovan saw something in his eyes that she recognized from the dueling arena. That same terrible calm that came before violence. Begin evacuation of non-essential personnel to the colony ship, he ordered, and plot a ramming course for the lead pirate vessel. Captain? His first officer asked, and fear cracked her voice. The colony ship cannot outrun them, and we cannot outfight them. But if we take out their command vessel, it might create enough chaos for our people to escape. He was going to sacrifice himself, Sarathovan realized. Just as he had been willing to die in the arena, this human would throw away his life without hesitation if it meant saving others. There is another way, she heard herself say, and every eye on the bridge turned to her. Do-hyun looked at her with surprise and something else. Something like hope that he was afraid to feel. What way? Sarathovan walked to the communication console and opened a channel to the pirate fleet, and when she spoke, Her voice carried the full weight of Volanti royalty. "This is High Princess Sarath Avan of the Volanti Empire, and I am declaring these humans to be under my personal protection." Static crackled, and then a rough voice answered with barely concealed amusement. "Pretty words, Princess, but you are a long way from home, and your Empire ships are nowhere to be seen." "My Empire ships are everywhere," Sarathavan replied, and her voice could have frozen stars. "And if you harm a single human in this convoy, the Volanti will consider it an act of war, and we will hunt you and your families and everyone who has ever sheltered you to the ends of the galaxy." Silence stretched for a long moment. "You would start a war for humans?" the pirate captain asked, and his amusement had curdled into uncertainty. Sarathavan looked at Do-Yun. This tired human who had fought for his people and shown mercy to his enemies and worked alongside his crew as if he was no better than any of them. "Yes," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I would." More silence. And then the pirate ships began to turn away one by one, until only empty space remained. Do-Yun released a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. Sarathavan met his eyes and felt something shift inside her chest. "You showed me mercy when you had every reason for cruelty," she replied. "Consider this a beginning of repayment." Do-Yun woke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of medical equipment, and for a long moment he could not remember where he was or why his body felt like it had been fed through an industrial grinder. Then memory returned like a flood, and he tried to sit up so quickly that pain exploded through his chest and shoulder and forced him back down with a gasp. "Easy, Captain," a familiar voice said, and he turned his head to see Dr. Shin from the colony ship sitting beside his bed with exhaustion written across her features. "You have been unconscious for 3 days, and I have spent most of that time putting your insides back where they belong." "The colony," Do-Yun managed, and his voice came out as a croak. "Our people safe," she replied, and a smile broke through her weariness. "The Concorde released the ship immediately after your victory, and we have been waiting here for you to recover enough to travel." Something tight in Do-Yun's chest finally loosened, and he closed his eyes as relief washed over him. He had done it, somehow, against all odds. He had actually done it. "There is a complication," Dr. Shin continued, and her tone shifted to something more uncertain. "Several Concorde delegates have been asking to speak with you, and there is also a Volanti princess who has requested an audience." Do-Yun opened his eyes again. "A princess?" "The one who was watching from the stands during your duel, along with her attendants," the doctor explained. "Apparently there is some legal issue that requires your attention." Before Do-Yun could ask more questions, the door to his medical room slid open and a delegation entered without waiting for permission. The Concorde judge floated at the front, its crystalline body catching the light in patterns that made Do-Yun's head ache. And behind it came 4 Volanti women who carried themselves with the bearing of royalty. He recognized the tallest one from the arena, the silver-skinned princess whose 4 eyes had watched him so intently during the duel, and her 3 attendants flanked her like shadows. "Captain Kang Do-Yun," the judge intoned, "there is a matter of law that must be addressed before you depart this station." Do-Yun tried to sit up again, slower this time, and Dr. Shin helped him adjust the bed to support his weight. "What matter?" he asked, and his eyes moved between the judge and the princess. "The duel is finished, and my people are free. So what else is there to discuss?" The judge's voice resonated with something that might have been regret. "You invoked the ancient law of trial by champion, and you won, and your people are indeed free. But the same law that freed them has bound others to you." Princess Sarathavan stepped forward, and her face was a mask of controlled neutrality that could not quite hide the tension in her body. Lord Casavarn fought as my champion, she said, and her voice was steady despite what those words cost her. He traveled under my banner, and by ancient law. His defeat transfers all blood debt to me. Do-hyun stared at her, not understanding. What does that mean? It was Yvonne, the senior handmaiden, who answered, and her tone was clipped and formal. It means that you have claimed rights over everyone who traveled under the princess's authority. And according to Volanthi law, we now belong to you. The words hung in the air like poison. Do-hyun looked at the four women standing before him. These aliens who had watched his people nearly become slaves. And he felt something cold settle in his stomach. That cannot be right, he said. And he turned to the judge. I never asked for this, and I do not want it. The law does not care what you want, the judge replied. The debt exists, and it must be honored. The youngest Volanthi, barely more than a girl, was trembling slightly, and the fierce one who stood like a warrior had her hand on her weapon as if she expected violence. Only the princess and her senior attendant seemed calm, though Do-hyun could see the effort it cost them. If I refuse? He asked. Then the princess will have dishonored an ancient covenant, the judge explained, and the Volanthi Empire will lose all legal standing within the Concord, a blow that would cripple their influence for generations. My father has already sent word, the princess said, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been pain. He demands my return, but the Concord's laws are clear, and if I do not honor this debt, our entire empire suffers. Do-hyun was silent for a long moment. He thought about what the Volanthi had tried to do to his people, the slavery they had wrapped in legal language, the poison that had nearly killed Commander Yu, the laughter when he had stepped forward to fight. He thought about how easy it would be to take this revenge that had been handed to him, and then he thought about the 12,000 people on the colony ship who would have been slaves if he had lost. And he knew that he could not become the thing he had fought against. I do not want slaves, he said, and his voice was tired but firm. Tell me how to set them free. The princess's mask cracked, just for an instant, and he saw genuine shock in her four eyes. You would release us? She asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. I fought for my people's freedom, Do-hyun replied, and he met her gaze without flinching. What kind of man would I be if I turned around and took someone else's? The judge made a sound that might have been a sigh. The law does not permit immediate release, for the debt must be served for one full solar cycle or repaid through equivalent service. And there is no mechanism to simply dismiss it. Then we find another way, Do-hyun said. They stay with me. They travel with my people. And when the cycle ends, they are free to go wherever they want. He looked at the princess and her attendants, and he tried to find the words to make them understand. I will not treat you as property, and I will not give you orders, and I will not punish you for what your people tried to do to mine, because that is not who I am. Yvonne's eyes narrowed with suspicion that had been earned through centuries of Volanthi politics. You expect us to believe that you want nothing from us. I expect nothing, Do-hyun replied, and exhaustion dragged at his voice. But I hope that maybe, by the time the cycle ends, you will have seen enough to know that humans are not what you were taught to believe. Princess Sarathavan stared at him for a long moment. This wounded human who had been given power over her and chosen not to use it. And she felt the foundations of everything she knew begin to shake. You are unlike anything I expected, she said finally. Do-hyun almost smiled. I get that a lot. The dueling arena of the Galactic Concord was ancient beyond measure. A circular chamber of black stone, where the lights seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And the stands rose in tiers around the central pit where countless disputes had been settled in blood. Representatives of 12 species filled those stands today, their bodies ranging from the crystalline to the organic to things that defied easy description. and all of them had come to watch a human die. Princess Sarathovan sat in the position of honor reserved for the Volanti delegation. Her attendants arranged around her, and she kept her expression carefully neutral as the two champions were announced. Lord Casavarn entered first, resplendent in armor that had been crafted by master artisans over generations, each blade etched with the record of his victories, and his plasma blade hummed at his side with a sound like distant thunder. The crowd cheered for him, for he was known throughout the Concord as an undefeated warrior, and his 200 victories were the stuff of legend. Then the human entered, and the cheering turned to laughter. Kang Do-yoon wore no armor at all, just simple clothes that left his arms and legs free to move, and his face bore the marks of a man who had not slept in days. Tessic leaned toward the princess and made a sound of contempt. "This is not even sport," she said, and her voice dripped with disdain. "It is butchery." "Perhaps that is the point," Yvonne replied quietly, and her eyes were thoughtful as she watched the human take his position. The Concord judge's crystalline voice rang out across the arena. "Champions, approach the weapon vault and make your selections." Lord Casavar did not bother to approach, simply drawing the plasma blade that hung at his hip. "The weapon of Volanti nobility for 10,000 years. I need nothing else," he declared, and his confidence filled the arena like a physical presence. Do-hyun walked to the ancient vault where weapons from 100 worlds were stored, and he studied the contents for a long moment while the crowd grew restless. Finally, he reached inside and withdrew his choices: a metal pipe, roughly the length of his arm, simple and unadorned, and a combat knife with a blade no longer than his hand. The laughter that followed was so loud that it echoed off the stone walls, and even some of the judges seemed to shake their heads at the absurdity. Lorith, the youngest of the princess's attendants, actually giggled behind her hand. "Does he mean to insult Lord Casavarn by dying with such pathetic weapons?" she asked, but Yvonne did not laugh, and neither did Princess Sarathovan, for they had both noticed something that the others had missed. The human's eyes were calm, not afraid, not desperate, not resigned to death, but calm and measured, and watching Lord Casavarn's every movement with the patience of a hunter. "Begin." The judge commanded. Lord Casavarn moved like liquid silver, his plasma blade singing through the air in an arc that should have taken Do-hyun's head from his shoulders. But the human was not there. He had stepped to the side at the last possible moment, his movements ugly and graceless compared to the Volanti's elegant technique, but effective. The blade missed by a finger's width. Casavarn pressed forward, his attacks coming faster now, each one perfectly executed. Each one meant to end the fight in a single stroke, and each one missed, or was deflected by that simple metal pipe, or found only empty air where the human had been a heartbeat before. The crowd fell silent, confused by what they were seeing. "He is not fighting," Tessic observed, and her voice had lost some of its contempt. "He is surviving." Princess Sarathovan leaned forward in her seat, her four eyes focused entirely on the human, and she began to understand Do-hyun was not trying to win, not yet, for he knew he could not match the Volanti's speed or skill or strength. He was learning. Every attack Casavarn made taught him something. Every movement revealed a pattern, and those calm eyes were cataloging it all with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. The plasma blade finally found its mark, slicing across Do-hyun's ribs and leaving a wound that smoked and bled freely. He staggered but did not fall. Another strike took him across the thigh, and the smell of burned flesh filled the arena. He kept moving. A third blow opened his shoulder to the bone, and blood poured down his arm in rivers. He did not yield. "Why does he not fall?" Lorith whispered, and her voice had lost all trace of mockery. "Humans are from a death world," Yvonne answered, and there was something like respect in her tone. "They are built to endure damage that would kill most species." Lord Casavarn was growing frustrated now. his elegant technique becoming sloppier as his prey refused to die. And his attacks grew wider, more aggressive, less controlled. That was when Do-hyun struck. He did not parry the next blow, but stepped into it, letting the plasma blade sink deep into his left shoulder, and before Kesavarn could pull back, Do-hyun's metal pipe came down on the Volante's arm with a crack that echoed through the silent arena. Kesavarn screamed as bones shattered beneath the impact. The plasma blade was trapped now, stuck in Do-hyun's shoulder, and the human's right hand came up with that simple combat knife and drove it into Lord Kesavarn's throat. The Volante champion's eyes went wide with shock as purple blood poured from the wound. And he tried to speak, tried to understand how this had happened. But no words came. He fell to the black stone floor and did not move again. For a long moment there was absolute silence. Then the judge's voice rang out, clear and final. The human is victorious, and the blood debt is settled. And the charges against the human colony are dismissed. Kang Do-hyun stood over the body of the champion who had never been defeated, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood pooling around his feet from a dozen wounds that should have killed him. He swayed once, then twice, and then his legs gave out beneath him and he collapsed onto the stone. But he was alive and somewhere in the stands. Human voices were screaming and weeping and celebrating all at once. Princess Sarathovan found that she could not look away from the fallen human, this nobody who had just killed the greatest warrior of her generation. And her hands were trembling, though she did not know why. Impossible. Tessic breathed beside her. Yevon said nothing at all. But her eyes held a calculation that the princess recognized something had changed in the arena today. Something that could not be undone, and Sarathovan had the terrible feeling that her life would never be the same. The Galactic Concord station hung in the void between stars, like a monument to laws older than most civilizations remembered. And today those ancient laws would decide the fate of 12,000 human souls. Captain Kang Do-hyun stood at the observation window of the detention level, watching the colony ship that carried his people drift under heavy guard. And he felt the weight of their lives pressing against his chest like a physical thing. 3 months ago, they had fled Earth's dying colonies with nothing but hope and whatever supplies they could carry. And 3 months of running had led them here, to this neutral station where the Volante Empire had finally cornered them. The Volante claimed the humans had crossed into their territory without permission. And under Concord law, they had the right to demand compensation. And the compensation they demanded was everything. The ship, the supplies, and every man, woman, and child aboard slavery by another name, wrapped in legal language that made the other species look away and pretend it was not their concern. But there was one chance. One ancient law that even the Volante could not ignore. Trial by champion. If the humans could defeat the Volante's chosen warrior in single combat, all charges would be dropped, and they would be free to continue their journey. Do-hyun had watched their appointed champion, a retired soldier named Commander Yu, collapse in the medical bay just 6 hours before the duel was scheduled to begin. And the doctors said it was poison, something that attacked only human biology, something that could not be traced. The Volante delegate had smiled when he heard the news and offered his deepest sympathies. Now the humans had no champion, and in 4 hours the deadline would pass, and 12,000 people would become property. Do-hyun pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. He was not a duelist, not a warrior, not anyone special, just a freighter captain who had spent 20 years hauling cargo between stations, and who had served a brief stint in the Earth Defense Force when he was young and stupid, but he remembered how to fight. And more importantly, he remembered how to survive. He turned away from the window and walked toward the Concord's administrative center, where the delegates waited. High Princess Sarathovan of the Volante Empire watched the proceedings from her elevated seat with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. though inside she felt the familiar distaste that these legal spectacles always inspired in her. She was tall even by Volante standards, her silver skin catching the light in ways that made her seem to glow. And her four eyes moved independently as she observed the various delegates arguing below. She had not come here for this, had not expected to witness the enslavement of an entire species during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic tour. But the law was the law, and her people had invoked it properly. Her senior handmaiden Yevhen leaned close and whispered in her ear. The humans appear to have no replacement champion. Your Highness, and the deadline approaches. I can see that, Sarathovan replied, keeping her voice low. It seems almost too convenient, Yevhen continued, and her tone carried the weight of unspoken suspicion. Sarathovan did not respond, but she had noticed the same thing, and she wondered if Lord Kesavan, the champion her people had appointed, had played some role in the human fighter's sudden illness. Kesavan stood at the center of the chamber in his ceremonial armor, his plasma blade already humming at his hip, and he looked eager, hungry even. Like a predator who could smell wounded prey, he had never lost a duel in 200 attempts, and he clearly expected to add another easy victory to his record. One way or another, the youngest of Sarathovan's attendants, a girl named Lorith, who had barely reached her adult years, tugged at the princess's sleeve. Will they really take all those people as slaves? She asked, and her voice trembled slightly. It is the law, Sarathovan said. Though the words tasted bitter, Tessic, her guard maiden, snorted softly from her position behind the princess's chair. Weak species should not wander into territory they cannot defend, she said, and her hand rested on her own weapon with casual arrogance. Sarathovan was about to respond when the chamber doors opened and a human walked in. He was not impressive by any standard she could measure, neither tall nor particularly strong, with a face that showed lines of exhaustion and hair that had gone gray at the temples. And he wore simple clothes that bore the stains of work rather than the polish of nobility. He walked to the center of the chamber and stood before the assembled delegates. And when he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. I am Captain Kang Do-yoon of the colony ship Horizon's Promise, and I volunteer to serve as humanity's champion. A murmur ran through the chamber, and several delegates laughed openly. Lord Kesavarn's smile widened into something predatory. You? He said, and his translator rendered his amusement perfectly. You are no warrior, human, and I can smell the fear on you from here. Do-yoon looked at him with eyes that held no fire, no defiance, nothing but a deep and terrible weariness. I am afraid, he admitted, and the chamber fell silent at the unexpected honesty. I am afraid because I know what you are and what you have done, and I know that I will probably die in 4 hours. But those are my people on that ship, and I will not let them become slaves while I still have breath in my body. He turned to face the Concord judge, an ancient creature of crystal and light who had presided over these proceedings for centuries. I invoke my right to stand as champion, and I accept whatever consequences follow. The judge's voice resonated through the chamber like wind chimes in a storm. The right is granted, and the duel will proceed as scheduled. And may the laws of the Concord judge. The worthy Princess Sarathovan found herself leaning forward, studying this human who had just signed his own death warrant, and she felt something stir in her chest that she could not name. It was not pity, for the Volante did not waste pity on lesser species, and it was not admiration, for what was there to admire in a man walking to his death? But when Do-yoon turned, and his eyes met hers for just a moment, she saw something that made her breath catch. He was not fighting because he thought he could win. He was fighting because someone had to, and no one else had stepped forward. Yevhen touched her arm gently. Your Highness, are you well? Sarathovan straightened in her seat and composed her features. I am fine, she said, and she wondered why it felt like a lie below. Lord Kesavan was already calling for his attendants to prepare his formal dueling armor. and his laughter echoed through the chamber like a promise of blood, and Kang Do-yoon stood alone in the center of it all. A small and tired human who had just bet his life on the chance to save his people in 4 hours. He would almost certainly be dead, but until then, he would stand.